My name is Victoria Hayes, and for the past 15 years, I've carried secrets that could reshape global security. While most people worry about their daily commutes, I've been stopping cyber attacks that could cripple entire nations. While families gather for Sunday dinner, I've been in windowless rooms making decisions that protect millions of lives. But to my sister Natalie, I was nothing more than a failure who couldn't even afford a decent car. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Standing in her pristine Mount Pleasant kitchen that morning, surrounded by granite countertops and designer everything, I felt smaller than I had since childhood. The woman who commanded respect from admirals and world leaders was being lectured about life choices by someone who thought my greatest accomplishment was getting a government desk job. "Victoria, you're 38 years old," Natalie said, her voice dripping with the same condescension she'd perfected in high school. "When are you going to grow up and get a real career? Derek's been promoted to commander, and here you are, still working some mysterious little office job that barely pays your rent." I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into patterns that reminded me of satellite imagery from classified briefings. How could I explain that my little office job involved coordinating with the Pentagon on matters of national security? How could I tell her that world leaders knew my name, even if she didn't understand what I really did? "My work is important, Nat," I said quietly, using the childhood nickname that once meant something between us. She laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Important? You drive a 15-year-old Honda and live in a one-bedroom apartment. Important people don't live like that, Victoria. Important people have something to show for their lives." The conversation that morning wasn't unusual. For years, family gatherings had become exercises in endurance, with Natalie cataloging my failures while showcasing her perfect life. Her husband Derek was climbing the ranks in the Navy, their house was featured in the neighborhood magazine, and their social calendar was packed with officer wives events and charity galas. Meanwhile, I remained the mysterious sister who worked for some government agency and never talked about her job. What Natalie didn't know was that my modest lifestyle was deliberate. When you hold a security clearance that requires congressional oversight, when your work involves cyber warfare capabilities that could change the balance of global power, you learn to live quietly. Flashy cars and expensive homes attract attention, and attention is something people in my position cannot afford. But that morning, something in her tone cut deeper than usual. Maybe it was the way she emphasized real career, or how she looked at me like I was a charity case she'd grown tired of supporting emotionally. The truth was, Natalie had never really understood me, even before my work became classified. Growing up, she was the social butterfly, the one who dated football players and got elected to homecoming court. I was the quiet one who spent summers at computer camps and read technical manuals for fun. Our parents had died in a car accident when I was 25, leaving us with only each other. I thought that tragedy might have brought us closer, but instead it seemed to widen the gap between us. Natalie threw herself into building the perfect life, as if enough success could shield her from loss. I threw myself into work that mattered, into protecting people from threats they would never see coming. The irony was that Derek's naval career, which Natalie was so proud of, operated in a completely different sphere from mine. He was conventional Navy, focused on ship operations and traditional maritime strategy. My world was digital warfare, cyber intelligence, and the kind of threats that kept national security advisors awake at night. Our paths had never crossed professionally, which meant he had no idea who I really was either. "You know what your problem is, Victoria," Natalie continued, refilling her coffee cup with the expensive blend she ordered from some boutique roaster. "You've never been willing to put yourself out there. You hide behind this whole mysterious act like you're protecting state secrets or something." The comment hit closer to home than she realized, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of high-stakes negotiations had taught me to control my reactions, even when my own sister was unknowingly mocking the very thing that defined my existence. "Maybe I just value privacy," I said, standing to rinse my cup in her spotless sink. "Privacy is one thing, this is something else entirely. It's like you're ashamed of what you do, which honestly maybe you should be. How do you expect to meet someone, to build a life, when you won't even tell people what you do for work?" I dried my hands on her monogrammed dish towel, thinking about the relationships I'd sacrificed for my career. The dates that ended when I couldn't explain why I traveled so much, or why I carried 3 different phones, or why I sometimes disappeared for weeks without being able to say where I was going. Natalie was right about one thing: my life didn't look successful from the outside. But she was wrong about everything else. I'm fulfilled by my work, I said simply. Fulfilled doesn't pay for retirement, Victoria. Fulfilled doesn't buy a house or give you security. You're living like a college student while people our age are building actual lives. The kitchen fell silent except for the humming of her expensive refrigerator. Through the bay window, I could see her perfectly manicured backyard, complete with the hot tub Derek had installed after his last promotion. Everything about Natalie's life screamed success in the most traditional sense. She had the house, the husband with the impressive title, the social status that came with being a commander's wife. What she didn't have was the knowledge that her younger sister had been personally briefed by the Secretary of Defense just 3 weeks earlier. She didn't know that I'd spent the previous month working with a joint task force to prevent a coordinated cyber attack on the nation's power grid. She had no idea that the mysterious little office job she mocked involved overseeing digital security operations that protected everything from financial systems to nuclear facilities. But the most painful part wasn't her ignorance about my work. It was the realization that even if she knew the truth, she might not understand why it mattered. Natalie measured success by visible markers, rank insignia, house size, social connections, the idea that someone could find meaning in anonymous service, in work that deliberately remained hidden, seemed foreign to her worldview. Derek's captain is hosting a family day next weekend, she said, switching topics with the sudden brightness she used when she wanted to showcase her social connections. All the senior officers and their families will be there. You should come. Maybe being around successful people will inspire you to make some changes. The invitation stung, wrapped as it was in the assumption that I needed inspiration from successful people. But something else caught my attention. Derek's captain, I'd been so removed from his day-to-day work that I'd never really considered who he reported to, what chain of command he operated within. Who's his captain? I asked, trying to sound casual. Captain Anthony Rivera. He's being considered for Admiral, according to Derek. Very impressive man, apparently. Distinguished service record, multiple commendations. The kind of person who actually makes something of themselves. The name Anthony Rivera hit me like a physical blow. I knew Captain Rivera, though he wouldn't know me by sight. More accurately, I knew his file, his service record, his security clearance level. 6 months earlier, I'd personally approved a joint operation that fell under his command structure. The irony was almost too perfect. Natalie was inviting me to meet someone who, in the complex hierarchy of naval operations, actually reported to people who reported to me. I'll think about it, I said, though my mind was already racing through the implications. You'll think about it, Victoria, this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is an opportunity to network, to meet people who could help you. But instead of jumping at the chance, you're going to think about it's like everything else in your life. I bit back the response that wanted to escape. How could I explain that networking wasn't a challenge for me, that I regularly interfaced with military leaders whose names appeared in classified briefings? How could I tell her that my problem wasn't access to important people, but rather the need to keep my access secret? The truth is, Natalie, you don't really know what my life is like. I said finally. I know enough. I know you're wasting your potential, Victoria. I know you're hiding from life instead of embracing it. And I know that if you don't start making changes soon, you're going to wake up at 50, with nothing to show for yourself except a bunch of excuses about privacy and fulfillment. Her words hung in the air like an accusation. For a moment I considered telling her everything. I imagined the look on her face, if I revealed that I held the rank of Rear Admiral, that I'd been personally commended by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that foreign intelligence agencies considered me one of the most dangerous people they'd never heard of. But security protocols weren't just suggestions, they were absolute requirements. My clearance level meant that even my family couldn't know the full scope of my work. Instead, I picked up my purse and headed toward the door. I should get going. Of course you should. Run away like you always do when someone tries to have a real conversation with you. I paused with my hand on the door frame, looking back at my sister. She stood in her perfect kitchen, surrounded by all the markers of success she valued so highly, and I realized that we'd become strangers. Not because of geography or time, but because we'd chosen completely different definitions of what mattered in life. I love you, Nat, I said quietly. But you're wrong about me, you're wrong about almost everything. She shook her head with the patient expression of someone dealing with a particularly stubborn child. Prove it then. Come to the family day. Meet some people who've actually accomplished something with their lives. Maybe it'll motivate you to finally grow up. I walked out of her house knowing that everything was about to change. The family day she was so casually inviting me to would bring together two worlds I'd spent years keeping separate. Captain Rivera would be there, along with other officers whose names I recognized from classified briefings and operational reports. For the first time since I'd taken my oath of service, my carefully constructed privacy was about to collide with my family's expectations. The drive back to my apartment gave me time to think through the implications. Naval Weapons Station Charleston wasn't just any base. It was a critical installation where multiple branches of service intersected on matters of national security. If Derek was stationed there, if Captain Rivera was his commanding officer, then the family day wasn't just a social gathering. It was a convergence of military personnel who operated at the highest levels of classified operations. As I pulled into the parking lot of my modest apartment complex, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. Natalie was right about one thing. I didn't look like someone important. I'd deliberately cultivated an appearance of ordinariness, the kind of anonymous competence that allowed me to move through the world without attracting attention.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But in 3 days, that anonymity was going to disappear. The question wasn't whether I would attend the family day. The question was whether I was ready for my sister to learn who I really was, and whether our relationship could survive the revelation that everything she thought she knew about me was wrong. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching neighbors come and go from their own modest apartments. These were good people living quiet lives, and there was honor in that. But Natalie couldn't see honor in quiet service, couldn't understand that some of the most important work happened in shadows, protected by secrecy, and sustained by purpose rather than recognition. In 72 hours, I would walk into a room where my two worlds would collide. I would stand next to my sister, who thought I was worthless, and face officers who knew my real rank, my real authority, my real contributions to national security. The carefully maintained fiction of my ordinary life was about to shatter, and I had no idea what would be left when the dust settled. But as I finally walked up to my apartment, keys jingling in the evening air, I realized something else. I was tired of hiding. Tired of letting Natalie's disappointment in me grow larger, while my actual accomplishments remained invisible. Maybe it was time for the truth, regardless of the consequences. Maybe it was time for my sister to learn that the person she called worthless had been protecting everything she held dear. The call came at 05:00 hours, on a Tuesday, pulling me from the few hours of sleep I'd managed to steal between encrypted briefings. Lieutenant Grace Parker's voice was crisp and professional, but I detected the underlying tension that meant something significant was developing. Admiral Hayes, we have a situation developing in the South China Sea. SINPAC is requesting your immediate assessment of the cyber warfare implications. I was already reaching for my secure tablet before she finished speaking. The encrypted files that downloaded painted a picture that made my stomach clench. A coordinated series of attacks on shipping lane monitoring systems, satellite communications, and port security networks. The signature was sophisticated, state-sponsored, and uncomfortably familiar. How long do I have? I asked, pulling on my uniform in the pre-dawn darkness of my bedroom. Briefing is at 0630. The Secretary of Defense will be video conferencing from the Pentagon. Admiral Kane is flying in from Norfolk. Admiral Thomas Kane's involvement meant this wasn't just another regional skirmish in cyberspace. Kane and I had worked together on 3 major operations over the past 5 years, and he only traveled for situations that could escalate into international incidents. As I drove through the empty streets of Charleston toward the base, I tried to push thoughts of Natalie's upcoming family day out of my mind. Whatever was happening in the Pacific took precedence over personal drama. The Naval Weapons Station Charleston looked different in the early morning light. Security was heightened, with additional checkpoints and personnel I didn't recognize. My clearance got me through without questions, but I noticed the way the guards studied my identification more carefully than usual. Something big was definitely developing. The secure briefing room was already filled with personnel when I arrived. I recognized faces from previous operations, intelligence analysts, communications specialists, and senior officers whose expertise spanned multiple domains of warfare. Admiral Kane stood at the front of the room, his weathered face grave as he reviewed digital displays, showing shipping routes and network topology maps. "Admiral Hayes," he said, acknowledging my arrival with a nod. "Your timing is perfect. We're about to begin." The briefing that followed confirmed my worst suspicions. A coordinated cyber attack had targeted critical infrastructure across multiple Pacific naval installations. Port management systems had been infiltrated, satellite communications had been disrupted, and most concerning of all, several classified network segments showed signs of attempted penetration. The attack vectors are consistent with Advanced Persistent Threat Group 47. I said, studying the technical analysis on my tablet. "This is the same methodology we saw in the Baltic incident last year." Kane nodded grimly. "That's our assessment as well. Which means this isn't a probing attack. This is preparation for something larger." The next 6 hours blurred together in a cascade of secure communications, tactical assessments, and strategic planning. I found myself coordinating with cyber warfare specialists from 3 different time zones, analyzing malware signatures that most people couldn't even pronounce, and developing countermeasures for attack scenarios that read like science fiction. By noon, we had identified the primary intrusion vectors and begun implementing defensive protocols across the Pacific Fleet's digital infrastructure. But the real work was just beginning. Cyber warfare wasn't like conventional military action. It required constant vigilance, continuous adaptation, and the kind of technical expertise that took years to develop. "Admiral, we need you to lead the response team," Kane said during a brief break between briefings. "Your experience with this particular threat group makes you our best option for developing effective countermeasures." I accepted the assignment without hesitation, though it meant my schedule for the next week would be completely unpredictable. Classified operations had a way of consuming everything else in life, including family obligations and social events. As I walked back to my temporary office to coordinate with the Pentagon, my phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. "Don't forget about Saturday's Family Day. Derek is so excited to introduce you to his colleagues. Maybe you'll finally meet some people who can help you with your career." The irony was almost painful. While Natalie worried about my career prospects, I was coordinating a response to cyber attacks that could affect global shipping, international commerce, and regional stability. The people who could help my career she was so eager for me to meet were, in many cases, people who received their operational guidance from commanders like me. But my security clearance meant I couldn't explain any of this to her. The work that defined my professional existence had to remain invisible, protected by classification levels that most people didn't even know existed. So instead of correcting her assumptions, I sent back a simple response: "I'll be there if possible. Work situation developing." Her reply came back within minutes. "Victoria, this is exactly what I mean. You let some office job control your entire life. Important people make time for important things." I stared at her message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. How could I explain that the office job she dismissed so casually was currently protecting critical infrastructure that her husband's entire naval career depended on? How could I tell her that the work controlling my life was the same work that kept ships like Derek's operating safely in international waters? The afternoon brought new challenges, as the scope of the cyber attack became clearer. What had initially appeared to be a regional incident was actually part of a much larger operation targeting naval assets across 3 different theaters. I found myself in secure video conferences with commanders from European and Mediterranean commands, coordinating defensive measures across time zones and operational boundaries. The attack pattern suggests they're testing our response capabilities. I explained to a room full of officers whose collective experience spanned decades of naval operations. They're not trying to cause immediate damage. They're mapping our defensive networks, identifying vulnerabilities, and assessing our response times. Admiral Kane leaned forward in his chair. "Which means this is reconnaissance for something bigger." "Exactly. And based on the sophistication of their approach, I estimate we have perhaps 2 weeks before they attempt a full-scale operation." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. 2 weeks to reinforce digital defenses across multiple fleets, coordinate international response protocols, and prepare for an attack that could potentially disrupt global shipping routes. It was the kind of challenge that required expertise in areas most people couldn't even comprehend. As the briefing concluded, I realized my phone had been buzzing steadily with messages from Natalie. The Family Day event was now 3 days away, and she was becoming increasingly frustrated with my lack of enthusiasm for what she saw as a networking opportunity. Victoria, I'm starting to think you don't want to succeed. Derek's captain specifically asked about you after I mentioned you work for the government. This could be the break you've been waiting for. Captain Rivera had asked about me. The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the secure facility. Rivera's security clearance was high enough that he might recognize my name if Derek had mentioned it in the right context. If Natalie had described me as working for the government in some vague capacity, Rivera might have started making connections. I walked to my temporary office and closed the door, then opened my secure laptop to access personnel databases. Captain Rivera's file confirmed what I had suspected. His clearance level was sufficient to access certain operational summaries that included my name. He wouldn't know the full scope of my work, but he would recognize me as someone with significant authority in naval cyber operations. The family day was becoming more complicated by the hour. Not only would I be face-to-face with officers who knew my real rank, but I would be doing so while managing an active cyber warfare operation that required constant attention. The timing couldn't have been worse. My secure phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Lieutenant Parker's voice was tense when I answered. Admiral, we have a development. The threat group just attempted to penetrate the personnel database at Norfolk. They were specifically searching for information on cyber warfare specialists. The room suddenly felt colder. They're targeting individuals, not just systems. That's our assessment. We've implemented additional security protocols for all personnel involved in the current operation, but Admiral Kane wants to brief you personally on the implications. I was already gathering my materials when she continued. Ma'am, there's something else. The search parameters they used included terms that suggest they're looking for senior personnel with specific expertise in their operational methods. The words hung in the air like a threat. They weren't just mapping our defensive capabilities, they were trying to identify the people responsible for developing those defenses. People like me. I'll be right there, I said, ending the call. As I walked through the corridors of the naval facility, past offices filled with personnel working on conventional operations, I reflected on the strange duality of my existence. To most of the people I passed, I was just another officer going about routine business. They had no idea that the woman walking past their offices was coordinating responses to attacks that could reshape global power dynamics. But in 3 days, that anonymity would be shattered. I would walk into Natalie's family day event, where my sister would introduce me as her unsuccessful younger sister who worked some mysterious government job. And there, in front of Derek and his colleagues, my carefully maintained cover would collide with the reality of my position in ways I couldn't predict or control. The briefing with Admiral Kane confirmed my worst fears. The enemy wasn't just conducting reconnaissance, they were building targeting profiles for key personnel. My name, along with those of several other senior cyber warfare specialists, had appeared in their search parameters. We need to consider enhanced security protocols for affected personnel, Kane said, his expression grave. This goes beyond normal operational security. I nodded, understanding the implications. Enhanced security protocols meant restricted movement, additional protective details, and the kind of visibility that would make maintaining my cover nearly impossible. If security determined I needed protection, there would be no way to attend Natalie's family day without revealing my true position. But as I sat in that secure briefing room, surrounded by classified materials and the weight of national security responsibilities, I realized something else. I was tired of the deception. Tired of letting my sister believe I was worthless while I carried the burden of protecting everything she held dear. Maybe it was time for the truth to surface, regardless of the consequences. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of encrypted communications, tactical assessments, and strategic planning sessions. The cyber warfare operation was escalating exactly as I had predicted, with increasingly sophisticated probes testing our defensive measures. My team had successfully repelled 3 major intrusion attempts, but each attack revealed new vulnerabilities that required immediate attention. I barely left the naval facility during this period, catching a few hours of sleep in temporary quarters between briefings. Natalie's increasingly frustrated messages went largely unanswered as I focused on coordinating defensive measures across multiple time zones. The family day event was now less than 24 hours away, and I still hadn't decided whether I could safely attend. The decision was made for me during an emergency briefing Friday evening. Intelligence had identified a planned major offensive scheduled for the following week, targeting critical infrastructure across the Pacific Fleet. The scope was unprecedented, and the potential consequences were severe enough to warrant presidential briefing. Admiral Hayes, you'll need to brief the National Security Council on Monday, Kane informed me as the meeting concluded. Your assessment of the threat will be critical to their response planning. I accepted the assignment while simultaneously calculating the impossibility of maintaining my cover story with Natalie. Briefing the National Security Council wasn't the kind of responsibility that could be explained away as routine government work. But before I could worry about family complications, my secure phone rang with an urgent message from base security. Admiral, we have a situation. Your family members are attempting to access the base for tomorrow's Family Day event. There appears to be some confusion about your identity and clearance level. My heart stopped. Natalie and Derek were at the front gate, probably wondering why my name wasn't on their list of approved family members for the Family Day event. Worse, they were likely asking questions about my position and authority that base security couldn't answer without revealing classified information. I'll handle this personally, I said, already heading for the exit. As I drove toward the main gate, I realized that the careful separation between my professional and personal lives was about to collapse entirely. There would be no more hiding behind vague descriptions of government work, no more deflecting questions about my responsibilities and authority. In a few minutes, I would have to choose between maintaining operational security and preserving my relationship with my sister. The choice, I realized, had already been made for me. The moment Natalie decided to bring me to an event where my professional colleagues would be present, the collision between my two worlds became inevitable. Now I just had to figure out how to manage the aftermath. The main gate came into view ahead of me, and I could see Derek's car parked near the security checkpoint. Through the windshield, I could make out Natalie's animated gestures as she argued with the security personnel. She was clearly frustrated, probably demanding to know why her sister's name wasn't appearing in their systems the way she expected. I pulled up to the security checkpoint and rolled down my window, showing my identification to the guard on duty. His expression immediately shifted to one of recognition and respect. Admiral Hayes, ma'am, your family members are having some difficulty with the access protocols. I understand, I'll handle it from here. As I parked and walked toward Derek's car, I caught fragments of Natalie's conversation with the security officer. She was explaining that her sister worked for the government and should be on the approved list, her voice rising with each repetition. Derek sat quietly in the driver's seat, his expression suggesting he was beginning to suspect that something didn't add up about his sister-in-law's mysterious government position. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no turning back. I approached Derek's car with measured steps, each footfall bringing me closer to a conversation that would fundamentally alter my relationship with my sister. Through the windshield, I could see Natalie's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration, her hands gesturing emphatically as she tried to explain to the security officer why her sister should be granted base access for the Family Day event. Victoria, she called out as soon as she spotted me, relief flooding her voice. Thank goodness you're here. These people are saying you're not in their system for the Family Day, which makes no sense since you work for the government. Can you please explain to them that there's obviously been some mistake? Derek stepped out of the car, his naval officers bearing evident even in civilian clothes. He extended a hand toward me with the practiced courtesy of someone accustomed to military protocol, but I noticed the way his eyes assessed me with new interest. Something about the interaction at the security checkpoint had clearly raised questions in his mind. Victoria, good to finally meet you properly, he said. Natalie's told me so much about your government work. I have to admit, I'm curious about your specific role. In my experience, most federal employees don't have trouble accessing military installations for family events. The security officer stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral, but his posture indicating he was waiting for guidance on how to proceed. Staff Sergeant Mills had been manning this checkpoint for 3 years, and I'd seen him hundreds of times during my comings and goings from the base. He knew exactly who I was, but protocol prevented him from revealing my identity or rank without my explicit authorization. Admiral, he said quietly, using my title in a voice low enough that only I could hear. How would you like me to handle this situation? The moment hung suspended like a breath held too long. I could feel Natalie's expectant gaze, Derek's growing curiosity, and the weight of a decision that would reshape everything my sister thought she knew about me. For 15 years, I had protected my family from the complexities of my professional life by maintaining careful boundaries between the classified and the personal. Now those boundaries were dissolving, and I had to choose how much truth to reveal. Staff Sergeant Mills, I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority that came naturally after years of command. Please add my family members to the access list for today's Family Day event. Standard security protocols apply. Yes, ma'am.
Whoa!
Right away, Admiral. The title hung in the air like an explosion waiting to detonate. I watched Derek's expression shift from curiosity to confusion to something approaching shock. His eyes moved from my face, to my modest civilian clothes, to the respectful posture of the security personnel, as if he was trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he was seeing. Natalie, however, seemed to have missed the significance entirely. She was too focused on her victory over the security checkpoint to process the implications of how the guard had addressed me. See? I told you there was a mistake, she said triumphantly. Victoria works for the government, so obviously she should have access. Sometimes these bureaucratic systems just get confused. Derek was still staring at me with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. Victoria, he said slowly, did that security officer just call you Admiral? The question cut through Natalie's celebration like a blade. She turned to look at me with sudden attention, her brow furrowed, as she tried to process what she might have missed in the exchange. For a moment the only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the mechanical whir of the security gate mechanisms. There seems to be some confusion, I said carefully, buying time to consider how much I could safely reveal without violating security protocols. My work involves coordination with various military personnel. Sometimes the lines of authority can be complex. It was a deflection, technically truthful but deliberately incomplete. Derek's naval training made him sensitive to the nuances of military protocol, and I could see him analyzing my response with the same precision he would apply to navigating dangerous waters. Natalie, meanwhile, was beginning to look annoyed at what she perceived as unnecessarily complicated explanations for a simple administrative issue. Can we just go to this Family Day thing? She said, impatiently. I don't understand why everything has to be so mysterious with you, Victoria. It's like you're trying to make your job sound more important than it actually is. Derek shot her a sharp look, the kind of expression that suggested he was beginning to understand something she was still missing. Natalie, I think there might be more to Victoria's position than we realized. What do you mean? She works for the government. Lots of people work for the government. That doesn't make her special. The casual dismissal stung more than I expected. Even faced with evidence that contradicted her assumptions, Natalie was clinging to her established narrative about my failures and limitations. It was as if acknowledging my success would require her to fundamentally restructure her understanding of our relationship, and she wasn't prepared to do that work. Staff Sergeant Mills returned with temporary access badges for Derek and Natalie, his movements crisp and professional. Your guests are cleared for the Family Day event, Admiral. Security escort will be available if needed. Thank you, Staff Sergeant, that won't be necessary. As we walked toward the cars, Derek fell into step beside me, while Natalie moved ahead, examining her temporary badge with the distracted air of someone more interested in the social aspects of the upcoming event than its military significance. Victoria, Derek said quietly, his voice carefully modulated to avoid carrying to his wife. I need to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer. What is your actual rank and position? I glanced toward Natalie, who was already pulling out her phone to take a selfie with the naval base in the background, apparently planning to document her arrival for social media. The contrast between her superficial engagement with military life and Derek's growing awareness of its deeper complexities was stark. Derek, there are certain aspects of my work that I can't discuss in detail. Security protocols exist for important reasons. I understand security protocols. I've held a clearance for 12 years. But what I'm asking goes beyond operational details. If you're holding the rank that security officers seem to indicate, then there are implications for how this Family Day is going to unfold. He was right, of course. Captain Rivera would be at the Family Day event, along with other senior officers, whose security clearances would allow them to recognize my name and position. The moment I walked into that gathering, my cover would be blown in front of an audience that included Derek's professional colleagues and my sister's social circle. Let me ask you this, I said, choosing my words carefully. If hypothetically someone in your extended family held a senior position in naval operations, how do you think that information should be handled in a social setting? Derek stopped walking, his expression growing serious as he processed the implications of my question. You're asking about operational security in a family context. Among other things. He was quiet for a long moment, his naval officer's training, warring with his curiosity and his concern for how this might affect his wife. Finally, he spoke with the measured tone of someone who had just realized he was navigating much deeper waters than he had initially understood. If someone in my extended family held senior naval rank, I would expect them to handle the disclosure carefully, with consideration for both security requirements and family dynamics. I would also expect that such a person would have good reasons for maintaining privacy about their position. That's a thoughtful response. Victoria, I need to know, is Natalie going to be blindsided by something at this family day? Because if she is, I'd rather prepare her now than have her find out in front of my commanding officer and his wife. The question forced me to confront the reality I'd been avoiding. Natalie was absolutely going to be blindsided, and the revelation was going to happen in the most public way possible. Captain Rivera would recognize me the moment we were introduced, and his reaction would make it impossible to maintain any pretense about my actual position. Derek, your wife has spent years believing certain things about me and my career. Some of those beliefs are going to be challenged today. How significantly challenged? Before I could answer, Natalie called out from ahead of us, her voice carrying the excited energy of someone anticipating a significant social event. Come on, you two. I want to get there while there's still time to make a good impression. Derek, you said Captain Rivera specifically wanted to meet Victoria, right? Derek's eyes met mine, and I saw understanding dawn in his expression. He was beginning to piece together the implications of his commanding officer's interest in meeting his supposedly unsuccessful sister-in-law. Yes, he said slowly. Captain Rivera was very interested when I mentioned that my sister-in-law worked for the government in a capacity related to naval operations. What exactly did you tell him about me? I asked. I mentioned that Natalie's sister worked in some kind of classified government position, but was very private about the details. I might have suggested that you were involved in intelligence work or something similar. Natalie turned around, catching the end of our conversation. Intelligence work. Victoria, you never told me you worked in intelligence. That actually sounds important. It's complicated, Nat. Everything is complicated with you. Why can't you just give straight answers about your job like normal people? Derek placed a gentle hand on his wife's arm. Natalie, some government positions require discretion for security reasons. That doesn't mean they're not important, but she drives a 15-year-old Honda, Derek. Important people don't drive 15-year-old Hondas. The conversation was beginning to feel surreal. My sister was so committed to her material definition of success that she couldn't conceive of someone choosing modesty despite having access to significantly greater resources. The irony was that my government salary, combined with various allowances for my security clearance level, was actually quite substantial. I chose to live modestly because drawing attention was counterproductive to my work, not because I couldn't afford better. Natalie, I said gently, there are many reasons why someone might choose to live quietly, even if they have other options. Like what reasons? Like preferring privacy. Like valuing substance over appearance. Like understanding that true importance doesn't require constant display. She stared at me for a moment, her expression suggesting she was trying to process a concept that fundamentally challenged her worldview. Derek, meanwhile, was watching this exchange with growing understanding of the dynamics that had shaped my relationship with my sister. We should probably head to the family day location, Derek said diplomatically. Captain Rivera is expecting us, and punctuality is important in military social events. As we walked toward the parking area where the family day was being held, I could see clusters of naval families gathering under white tents and around outdoor grilling stations. Children ran between the groups, while officers in civilian clothes mingled with their colleagues and families. It looked like any other military social gathering, but I knew that my presence would transform it into something much more significant. There's Captain Rivera, Derek said, pointing toward a tall man in khakis and a polo shirt who was speaking with several other officers near the main refreshment tent. He's the one I was telling you about, Victoria. Very distinguished service record, being considered for Admiral. I followed Derek's gesture and felt my stomach tighten. Captain Rivera was indeed someone I recognized, though not from Derek's descriptions. I had personally reviewed his promotion recommendations 6 months earlier, and his file had crossed my desk multiple times in connection with various operational assignments. He was a competent officer with an impressive record, but more importantly for the current situation, his security clearance was high enough that he would immediately recognize my name and position. "Should we go introduce ourselves?" Natalie asked, her voice bright with social anticipation. "In a moment," I said, buying time to prepare for what was about to unfold. Derek was studying my expression with the careful attention of someone trained to read situational dynamics. "Victoria, is there anything I should know before we approach Captain Rivera? Just be prepared for the possibility that this conversation might not go exactly as you expect." Before he could ask for clarification, Natalie was already walking toward Captain Rivera's group, her confident stride and bright smile indicating she was in full social networking mode. Derek and I followed, though I noticed he kept glancing at me with growing concern about what was about to happen. Captain Rivera spotted our approach and turned toward us with the practiced courtesy of a senior officer greeting the families of his personnel. His expression was polite but professional, until his eyes met mine. I watched recognition dawn in his face, followed immediately by something approaching shock. "Commander Walsh," he said to Derek, his voice carefully controlled. "I'm glad you could make it to the family day. Thank you for hosting this, Captain. I'd like you to meet my wife Natalie and her sister Victoria Hayes." The moment my name was spoken, Captain Rivera's entire demeanor shifted. His posture straightened, his expression became more formal, and I could see him quickly calculating the implications of my presence at a casual family gathering. "Miss Hayes," he said carefully, clearly uncertain about how to address me in this context. "It's an honor to meet you." Natalie beamed with satisfaction at what she interpreted as appropriate respect for her family connections. "Victoria works for the government too, Captain Rivera. Something in intelligence, apparently, though she's always very mysterious about the details." Captain Rivera's eyes widened slightly, and I could practically see him trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation without revealing classified information or inappropriate deference to rank in a social setting. "I see," he said slowly. "And what agency do you work for, if you don't mind me asking?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could deflect again, continue the careful dance of half-truths and misdirection that had protected my privacy for years. Or I could trust that Captain Rivera's professionalism would help him handle the revelation appropriately. "I work for the Navy, Captain," I said simply. "In cyber warfare operations." "Cyber warfare," Natalie said, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "You never told me you worked specifically for the Navy. That actually sounds quite important." Captain Rivera was staring at me with an expression that suggested he was rapidly reassessing everything he thought he knew about this family gathering. "Ma'am, could I ask about your specific role in cyber warfare operations?" The formal address wasn't lost on Derek, who was watching this exchange with growing awareness that something significant was happening. Natalie, however, seemed focused primarily on the increasing level of respect being shown to her previously dismissed sister. "I coordinate defensive operations across multiple theaters," I said, keeping my response technically accurate but deliberately understated. "Multiple theaters," Captain Rivera repeated slowly. "That would suggest a fairly senior position." "It does." The simple acknowledgement seemed to hit him like a physical blow. I could see him making the connections, remembering briefings where my name had appeared, operational summaries he had received, chains of command that suddenly made sense in a completely different way. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now carrying unmistakable deference, "I believe we may have worked together indirectly on several operations." "It's possible, Captain." Natalie was looking back and forth between us, her expression suggesting she was beginning to realize that this conversation was operating on levels she didn't fully understand. Derek, meanwhile, had gone very quiet, his military training allowing him to read the subtext that his wife was missing. "Victoria," Natalie said slowly, "exactly how senior is your position?" Before I could answer, another voice cut through the conversation from behind us. "Admiral Hayes." "Ma'am, I didn't expect to see you at a family social event." I turned to see Lieutenant Grace Parker approaching our group, her expression carrying the same mixture of surprise and professional respect that had marked Captain Rivera's reaction. She was in civilian clothes, clearly attending the family day with her own relatives, but her posture and tone immediately identified her as someone accustomed to military protocol. "Lieutenant Parker," I acknowledged, "I hope you're enjoying the family day." "Yes, ma'am. My parents are visiting from Oregon, and I thought they'd enjoy seeing the base." The exchange was brief and professional, but its impact on the group was immediate and devastating. Natalie's face had gone pale as the implications of what she'd just heard finally penetrated her consciousness. Derek was staring at me with an expression of complete shock, while Captain Rivera looked like he was trying to figure out whether he should be standing at attention during a casual family gathering. "Admiral," Natalie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did she just call you Admiral?" The moment I had been avoiding for 15 years had finally arrived, and there was no longer any way to deflect or minimize the truth. My sister was about to learn that everything she thought she knew about me was wrong, and the revelation was happening in front of her husband's commanding officer and colleagues. "Yes, Natalie," I said quietly, "she did." The silence that followed my confirmation stretched for what felt like an eternity. I watched my sister's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, and something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. Her mouth opened and closed several times as if she was trying to form words that wouldn't come, while Derek stood frozen beside her, his expression caught between professional respect and personal shock. Captain Rivera was the first to recover, his years of military training allowing him to navigate the unexpected revelation with practiced composure. "Admiral Hayes," he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of proper military deference, "I apologize for any breach of protocol. I wasn't aware of your presence at this family gathering." "No apology necessary, Captain," I replied, maintaining the calm authority that had become second nature over years of command. "This is a family day after all. Protocol can be somewhat flexible in social settings." Lieutenant Parker, recognizing the delicate nature of the situation unfolding, offered a respectful nod. "Admiral, I should return to my family. Please excuse me." "Of course, Lieutenant. Enjoy the rest of your day." As Parker walked away, I could feel the weight of multiple gazes boring into me. Other families at the gathering had begun to notice our group, drawn by the subtle shift in body language and the formal tone that had crept into our conversation. Word would spread quickly through the naval community that a senior admiral was present at what was supposed to be a casual family event. Natalie finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Admiral, you're an admiral in the Navy?" "Rear Admiral," I confirmed, watching her struggle to process information that fundamentally contradicted 15 years of assumptions about my life and career. "But that's impossible," she said, her voice growing stronger as shock gave way to something approaching anger. "Admirals don't drive old cars and live in tiny apartments. They don't let their sisters think they're failures." Derek placed a gentle hand on his wife's arm, his expression suggesting he was beginning to understand the complexity of what had been happening in his family. "Natalie, perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private." "No," she said sharply, shaking off his touch. "I want to understand this right now. Victoria, if you're really an admiral, then why have you been lying to me for years? Why have you let me think you were unsuccessful and directionless?" The pain in her voice cut deeper than any accusation could have. I could see that she felt betrayed, not just by the deception, but by the implications of what my hidden success meant about her own understanding of worth and achievement. "I never lied to you, Nat," I said carefully. "I told you I worked for the government in a capacity I couldn't discuss in detail. That was the truth. The truth, you let me lecture you about getting a real career while you outrank my husband by several levels. You let me feel sorry for you, Victoria. You let me worry about your future while you were commanding operations I probably can't even imagine." Captain Rivera shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could excuse himself from what was becoming an intensely personal family confrontation. But military protocol made it difficult for him to simply walk away from a senior admiral, even in a social setting. "Captain Rivera," I said, recognizing his discomfort, "please don't let our family discussion keep you from enjoying the family day. I'm sure there are other attendees you need to greet." "Thank you, Admiral, but I wonder if I might have a brief word with you first. There are some operational matters I'd like to discuss when you have a moment." Derek looked back and forth between us, his expression indicating he was beginning to grasp the professional relationship that existed between his commanding officer and his sister-in-law. "Captain, are you saying that Victoria outranks you?" "Commander Walsh," Rivera replied carefully, "Admiral Hayes holds a position that places her well above my level in the chain of command. Her authority extends across multiple theaters of naval operations." The words hit Derek like a physical blow. I could see him recalculating everything he thought he knew about his family dynamics, about the woman his wife had described as a professional disappointment. His own career, which Natalie had held up as a model of success, suddenly seemed modest in comparison to what I had achieved. How long? Natalie asked, her voice tight with emotion. How long have you been an admiral? I was promoted to rear admiral 4 years ago, I said quietly. 4 years, she repeated the words as if testing their weight. For 4 years, you've been one of the highest-ranking officers in the Navy, and you never told me. Nat, my security clearance requires discretion about the scope of my responsibilities. I couldn't discuss the details of my work, even with family. Security clearance doesn't explain why you drive a beat-up car or live like you're struggling financially. It doesn't explain why you let me believe you were wasting your life. Her questions were valid, and I realized that my explanations about security protocols only addressed part of the deception. The truth was more complex and more personal than I had been willing to admit, even to myself. I choose to live modestly because drawing attention to wealth or status can be dangerous in my line of work, I said. But you're right that it goes beyond security requirements. I suppose I also wanted to know that the people who cared about me did so because of who I am, not what I've achieved professionally. So this was a test. The accusation in her voice was sharp enough to cut. You were testing whether I would love you if I thought you were unsuccessful. No, it wasn't a test. It was self-protection. Derek had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding, and when he spoke, his voice carried the measured tone of someone trying to mediate a complex family crisis. Natalie, I think what Victoria is saying is that her position comes with risks and responsibilities that most people can't understand. Living quietly isn't just about security, it's about maintaining the kind of life that allows her to do her job effectively. Don't defend her, Derek, Natalie snapped. You don't understand what this feels like. Do you know how many times I've worried about her future? How many times I've tried to help her network or find better opportunities? I've spent years feeling guilty about my success while she struggled, and it was all unnecessary. The word guilty hung in the air like a revelation. For the first time, I began to understand that Natalie's criticism and concern hadn't just been about my perceived failures. They had been about her own discomfort with the disparity she thought existed between our lives. You felt guilty about your success? I asked softly. Of course I did. You're my sister, Victoria. You're brilliant and capable, and I couldn't understand why you weren't achieving anything meaningful with your life. It made me question whether I deserved what I had when you seemed to have so little. The confession reframed everything I thought I knew about our relationship. Natalie's lectures about my career hadn't just been about disappointment in my choices. They had been about her own struggle with survivor's guilt in a family where she believed she was the only one thriving. Captain Rivera cleared his throat gently, reminding us that we were still in a public setting with dozens of other military families nearby. Admiral, perhaps this conversation would be better continued in a more private setting. You're absolutely right, Captain, I said, suddenly aware that our family drama was unfolding in front of Derek's professional colleagues and their families. Natalie, Derek, would you like to continue this discussion somewhere less public? No, Natalie said firmly. I want to understand this now, while I'm still processing it. Victoria, if you're really an admiral, what exactly do you do? What are these responsibilities that are so important they justified lying to your family for years? I glanced at Captain Rivera, who gave me a barely perceptible nod indicating that he understood the sensitivity of what I was about to discuss. My security clearance allowed me to provide general descriptions of my work, but the details would have to remain classified. I coordinate cyber warfare defense operations across multiple naval theaters. I said carefully. When hostile entities attempt to attack our digital infrastructure, I'm responsible for organizing the response and developing countermeasures. Cyber warfare, Derek repeated slowly, his military background allowing him to grasp the implications more quickly than his wife. That's cutting-edge stuff, Victoria. The kind of work that requires years of specialized training and top-level security clearance. It does. Natalie was staring at me as if seeing a stranger. So when you disappear for weeks at a time, when you can't explain where you've been or what you're doing, it's because you're fighting actual wars that most people don't even know are happening. Sometimes yes. And the phone calls you take at all hours, the way you always seem distracted and worried about things you can't discuss. The threats we face don't operate on normal business hours. When a foreign power attempts to penetrate our defense networks, the response has to be immediate. She was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the reality of what my life actually entailed. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more uncertain than I had heard it in years. Victoria, I don't understand. If your work is that important, if you hold that level of responsibility, why didn't you trust me enough to tell me? Even if you couldn't discuss the details, you could have told me you were successful, that I didn't need to worry about you. The question went to the heart of everything that had gone wrong between us. I had protected my professional secrets so carefully that I had forgotten to protect our relationship. In my effort to maintain operational security, I had allowed my sister to believe the worst about my life and my choices. I was afraid, I admitted. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you would see me differently. Afraid that our relationship would change in ways I couldn't control. See you differently how? As someone whose work was more important than family. As someone who chose duty over personal relationships. As someone who disappeared into classified operations and left you to wonder whether I really cared about being your sister. Derek was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who was beginning to understand the deeper dynamics at play. Victoria, may I ask you something? Of course, when you made the choice to keep your position secret from family, were you protecting your work, or were you protecting yourself? The question was perceptive and uncomfortable. Derek had identified the distinction I had been unwilling to acknowledge. My secrecy had gone beyond what security protocols required, and had become a way to avoid the complicated emotional territory of family expectations and judgments. Both, I said honestly. But probably more the latter than I wanted to admit. Captain Rivera had been listening to this conversation with growing understanding of the personal costs that came with senior military leadership. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of respect that went beyond professional deference. Admiral, if I may say so, the balance between duty and family is one of the most challenging aspects of military service. There's no perfect answer to how much personal sacrifice is acceptable in service of national security. Thank you, Captain, that's generous of you to say. Natalie was looking back and forth between us, her expression suggesting she was beginning to grasp the complexity of the world I operated in. Captain Rivera, when you said Victoria coordinates operations across multiple theaters, what does that actually mean in practical terms? Rivera glanced at me, clearly seeking permission to elaborate within the bounds of what could be discussed publicly. I gave him a slight nod. It means, Mrs. Walsh, that your sister is responsible for protecting critical military and civilian infrastructure from some of the most sophisticated threats our nation faces. The work she does directly impacts the security of everything from power grids to financial systems to naval operations like your husband's. Derek's work is protected by operations Victoria coordinates. Among others, yes, the revelation seemed to hit Derek with particular force. He had been proud of his own service record, his steady progression through the ranks, his role in defending American interests abroad. Now he was learning that his sister-in-law had been operating at a level that made his own contribution seem modest by comparison. Victoria, he said slowly, I owe you an apology. I've been thinking of you as someone who needed career advice and professional guidance. I had no idea that you were actually protecting the very systems that allow people like me to do our jobs safely. You don't owe me any apology, Derek. You had no way of knowing. But I should have trusted that there was more to your story than what we could see on the surface. Natalie had gone very quiet, her earlier anger replaced by something that looked like grief. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Victoria, I've spent years being disappointed in you for not living up to your potential. But you weren't failing to achieve success. You were succeeding at a level I couldn't even imagine. And I was too focused on surface appearances to recognize it. Nat, you couldn't have known. But I should have trusted you. I should have believed that you were capable of making good choices for your life, even if I couldn't understand what those choices were. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of another naval family, the parents clearly eager to introduce themselves to Captain Rivera. He handled the interaction with professional courtesy, while signaling that he needed to return to his hosting duties. Admiral Hayes, he said before leaving. I hope we'll have the opportunity to discuss those operational matters I mentioned earlier. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting early next week. Of course, Captain, have your aide contact Lieutenant Parker to arrange the details. As Rivera walked away, I was left alone with Derek and Natalie, the three of us standing in the middle of a family day gathering that had fundamentally altered our relationships with each other. The casual social event had become a crucible that burned away years of misunderstanding and revealed truths that none of us had been prepared to face. "So what happens now?" Natalie asked quietly. "Now we figure out how to be a family again," I said, but this time with honesty about who we really are and what we really do. Derek looked around the gathering, noting the curious glances from other attendees who had witnessed parts of our conversation. "Victoria, I think word is going to spread pretty quickly about your presence here today. Are you prepared for that level of visibility?" "It was bound to happen eventually," I said. "I'm tired of hiding who I am, even if it complicates things." Natalie reached out tentatively and took my hand, her touch hesitant but sincere. "Victoria, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for not believing in you, for not trusting that you knew what you were doing with your life. I'm sorry for making you feel like you had to choose between your work and your family. I'm sorry too, Nat. Sorry for letting you worry about me when it wasn't necessary. Sorry for not finding a way to tell you the truth sooner." As we stood there, hands linked in the middle of a naval base family gathering, I realized that the revelation I had feared for so long had actually freed us both. Natalie no longer had to carry guilt about her success or worry about my failures. I no longer had to pretend that my life was smaller and less meaningful than it actually was. The truth, as painful as it had been to reveal, was also liberating. Now we could build a relationship on solid ground, with honesty about who we were and what we valued. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be real in a way it hadn't been for years. But as I looked around at the curious faces and whispered conversations beginning to spread through the gathering, I knew that this was only the beginning. Word of my presence would reach other corners of the naval community, and my carefully maintained privacy was about to become a thing of the past. The question wasn't whether I was ready for that change, but whether I could handle it in a way that protected both my work and my family. The balance Derek and Captain Rivera had spoken about was about to be tested in ways I had never experienced. The weeks following the Family Day revelation brought change I hadn't anticipated. Word of my presence at the naval gathering had indeed spread through military circles, but rather than creating problems, it had opened doors I didn't know I needed. Admiral Thomas Kane called personally to discuss a new joint task force initiative, and suddenly my calendar was filled with meetings that no longer required elaborate cover stories to explain to my sister. Natalie and I met for coffee the following Saturday at a small cafe near the harbor, our first private conversation since the truth had come out. She arrived early and was already seated when I walked in, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, as she stared out at the water with a thoughtful expression I hadn't seen from her in years. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this week," she said as I settled into the chair across from her. "About success, about what it means, about how I've been measuring it all these years." I ordered my usual black coffee and waited for her to continue, sensing that she needed to work through her thoughts at her own pace. "Derek and I had a long conversation after the Family Day," she continued. "He helped me understand some things about military service that I'd never really considered. About the sacrifices people make that no one ever sees. About the kinds of contributions that don't show up on social media or in neighborhood magazines." "What did he tell you?" She smiled, but it was tinged with something that looked like regret. "He said that the most important work often happens in shadows, and that the people doing it usually can't get credit for it. He said that if he'd known about your position, he would have been honored to serve under your command structure, even indirectly." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of my coffee, giving us both a moment to process the weight of what we were discussing. When the server moved away, Natalie leaned forward slightly, her expression more serious than I'd seen it in years. "Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Of course, when you were growing up, when we were kids, did you always know you wanted to do something like this? Something that would require you to be invisible in a way?" The question took me back to memories I hadn't revisited in years. I don't think I consciously knew it, but I was always drawn to puzzles that other people couldn't solve. I liked the idea of protecting people in ways they'd never know about. Like when you used to reprogram my computer games to make them easier when I was struggling, but you never told me you'd done it. I was surprised she remembered that. "You knew about that, I figured it out years later. You always did things like that, Victoria. You'd solve problems quietly, behind the scenes, and then act like nothing had happened." She was right. Even as a child, I had been more interested in making things work smoothly than in taking credit for fixing them. It was a pattern that had shaped my entire approach to life and work. I think that's why this has been so hard for me to understand. Natalie continued. I've always been the opposite. I need recognition, acknowledgement, visible proof that I'm contributing something meaningful. The idea of doing important work that no one knows about feels terrifying to me. There's nothing wrong with wanting recognition, Nat. The world needs people who can lead visibly, who can inspire others and build communities. Your work with the Officer Wives Charitable Foundation has probably improved more lives than I could count. But I've been so focused on appearances that I missed what was actually important. I've been measuring success by things like house size and car models and social connections, when you've been measuring it by whether people are safe, whether threats are neutralized, whether the country is protected. The admission was painful to hear because it revealed how deeply our different approaches to life had created a gulf between us. But it also offered hope that we could build something better going forward. I think we both lost sight of something important, I said. I was so focused on protecting my work that I forgot to protect our relationship. I let you worry about me when I should have found a way to reassure you without compromising security. How could you have done that? I could have told you I was successful without revealing specifics. I could have trusted you enough to share that I was fulfilled and challenged by my work, even if I couldn't explain exactly what that work involved. Natalie nodded slowly. And I could have trusted you enough to believe that you were capable of making good decisions for your life, even if I couldn't understand what those decisions were. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching boats move across the harbor while we both processed the conversation. Finally, Natalie spoke again, her voice softer than before. Victoria, there's something else I need to say. I've been jealous of you. The confession surprised me. Jealous of what? Of your sense of purpose. Of the way you've always seemed to know exactly what you wanted to do with your life, even when I couldn't see what it was. I've spent years building what I thought was a perfect life, but I've never felt the kind of conviction about my choices that you seem to have about yours. Nat, you've built something beautiful with Derek. You've created a home, a community, relationships that matter. That's not less important than what I do, it's just different. But it doesn't feel meaningful in the same way. When you describe your work, even in general terms, I can hear the passion in your voice. You know that what you do matters, that it makes a difference. I organize charity events and redecorate rooms, and plan dinner parties, and sometimes I wonder if any of it actually means anything. I reached across the table and took her hand. Natalie, do you know what happens to people in my line of work when we don't have connections to normal life? When we don't have family members who remind us what we're protecting? She shook her head. We burn out. We lose perspective. We forget that behind all the strategic planning and threat assessment, there are real people living real lives that matter. Your dinner parties and charity events and beautiful home aren't trivial. They're representations of the life that people like me work to preserve. For the first time since the revelation, I saw tears in her eyes. I never thought about it that way. I should have told you that years ago. I should have found a way to explain that your life isn't separate from my work. It's the reason my work matters. The conversation was interrupted by the buzzing of my secure phone. I glanced at the display and saw Lieutenant Parker's number with an urgent prefix. That meant immediate attention was required. I'm sorry, Nat. I need to take this. Admiral Hayes. Parker's voice was crisp and professional. We have a developing situation in the Taiwan Strait. Pupfleet is requesting your immediate assessment of cyber warfare implications. I could feel the familiar shift in my mind as I moved from personal conversation to operational mode. How immediate is immediate? Conference call in 30 minutes. Ma'am, full briefing materials are being transmitted to your secure device now. Understood. I'll be there. As I ended the call, I looked across the table at Natalie, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You have to go, she said, but it wasn't an accusation this time. It was an observation made with understanding. I do, but Natalie, this conversation isn't finished. There's more we need to talk about, more we need to work through. I know, but Victoria, watching you just now, seeing the way you shift when duty calls, I finally understand something I've been missing for years. What's that? This isn't just what you do, it's who you are, and I've been trying to change who you are instead of appreciating what that means. I stood to leave, but paused beside her chair. Who I am includes being your sister. That's not separate from my work, it's part of what makes the work possible. She looked up at me with a smile that was different from any I'd seen from her in years. It was proud, but not in the superficial way she'd been proud of social connections or material achievements. This was deeper, more genuine. Go save the world, Admiral, she said softly. I'll be here when you get back. The crisis in the Taiwan Strait required 3 days of intensive coordination, during which I barely left the secure facility. But this time, when I emerged back into normal life, I found messages from Natalie that showed she was beginning to understand the rhythm of my work rather than resenting it. Saw the news about tensions in the Pacific. Hope you're staying safe. Don't worry about calling back until things calm down. Derek says the situation is complex and will probably take a while to resolve. Take care of yourself. Made your favorite chocolate chip cookies. They'll be waiting whenever you're free. The messages weren't demanding or critical. They were supportive in a way that showed she was learning to love me as I actually was, rather than as she thought I should be. 2 weeks later, I received an invitation that changed everything again. The Secretary of Defense was hosting a reception for senior military leaders and their families, specifically designed to recognize the contributions of personnel whose work typically remained classified. For the first time in my career, I was being invited to bring family members to an event where my professional achievements would be publicly acknowledged. I called Natalie immediately. The Secretary of Defense is hosting a reception next month, I said without preamble. Family members are invited. It's specifically for people whose work usually goes unrecognized. Are you asking me to come? I'm asking if you want to come. If you're ready to see me in that context, with people who know what I do and understand its importance. There was a long pause before she agreed. Victoria, I would be honored to come. But I need to ask you something first. What? Will you be comfortable having me there? I know I haven't always been supportive of your choices, even when I didn't understand what they were. I don't want to embarrass you in front of your colleagues. The question revealed how much our dynamic had shifted. She was now worried about my comfort rather than demanding explanations for my choices. Natalie, you're my sister, you belong anywhere I belong. The reception was held at the Naval Observatory, in rooms that normally hosted diplomatic functions and high-level military briefings. As Natalie and I walked through the security checkpoints, I could see her taking in the gravity of the setting, the level of protocol, the caliber of people in attendance. Victoria, she whispered as we entered the main reception hall, there are some very important people here. There are, I agreed, watching her scan the room filled with senior military leaders, congressional representatives, and diplomatic personnel. Admiral Kane spotted us across the room and made his way over, his expression warm with professional respect and personal friendship. Admiral Hayes, he said, extending his hand. I'm so glad you could attend. Admiral Kane, I'd like you to meet my sister Natalie Walsh. Kane's greeting was gracious and warm, but I could see Natalie struggling to process the fact that this distinguished officer was clearly comfortable treating me as a peer. Mrs. Walsh, your sister is one of the finest officers I've had the privilege of working with. Her contributions to national security have been extraordinary. Thank you, Natalie managed, her voice carrying a note of wonder. I'm still learning about what Victoria actually does. That's understandable. The nature of her work requires a level of discretion that makes it difficult for family members to fully appreciate its scope. But I hope tonight will help illuminate some of that. As the evening progressed, I watched Natalie interact with my colleagues and their families, seeing her gradually understand the world I operated in. She met spouses of other senior officers who faced similar challenges in balancing security requirements with family relationships. She spoke with people whose work involved classified operations across multiple continents, who carried responsibilities that required constant vigilance and frequent sacrifice. The keynote speaker was the Secretary of Defense, who addressed the unique challenges faced by military personnel, whose contributions couldn't be publicly recognized. The men and women we honor tonight represent the finest traditions of service, he said. They work in shadows not because their contributions are small, but because they are so significant that national security depends on their anonymity. They sacrifice recognition so that others can sleep safely. During his remarks, I glanced at Natalie and saw tears streaming down her face. When I caught her eye, she mouthed the words, "I'm proud of you," with an expression of such genuine admiration that I felt my own eyes fill with tears. Later, as we walked to our cars in the cool evening air, Natalie was unusually quiet. Finally she spoke, her voice thoughtful and subdued. Victoria, I owe you an apology that's bigger than anything I said at the coffee shop. You don't owe me anything, Nat. Yes, I do. For years I've been measuring your worth by standards that were completely irrelevant to what you were actually doing. I was like someone criticizing a surgeon for having blood on their scrubs, completely missing the fact that they were saving lives. That's a dramatic comparison. Is it? Tonight I met people whose work protects millions of lives, people whose decisions affect global stability, people whose sacrifices make it possible for the rest of us to live normal lives. And you're one of them, Victoria, you've always been one of them. We reached our cars, but neither of us moved to leave. The conversation felt too important to interrupt. I need you to know something, Natalie continued. When I was criticizing your life choices, when I was pushing you to be more like me, I wasn't just wrong about your circumstances. I was wrong about what matters. Nat, no, let me finish. I've been so focused on building a life that looks successful from the outside that I lost sight of what success actually means. You've built a life that matters, that contributes something essential to the world. The fact that it doesn't come with visible markers of achievement doesn't make it less important, it makes it more important. I felt something shift between us, a fundamental realignment of how we understood each other and our relationship. For the first time in years, we were seeing each other clearly. Thank you for saying that, I said quietly. But I need you to know something too. Your life matters just as much as mine. The stability you've created, the community you've built, the love you've shared with Derek, the way you've maintained connections and relationships, all of that contributes to the world. I'm working to protect, but it's not the same level of responsibility. No, it's not. But responsibility isn't the only measure of value. The world needs people who create beauty, who build communities, who maintain the human connections that make life worth protecting. We need people who remember how to celebrate, how to create joy, how to make a house a home. Natalie smiled through her tears. So we're both contributing something important, just in different ways. Exactly, and maybe now we can appreciate what each of us brings instead of wishing the other person was different. 6 months later, our relationship had transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined. Natalie had become one of my strongest supporters, understanding when work demands meant canceled plans, celebrating my successes even when she couldn't know the details, and providing the kind of family stability that grounded me in the midst of international crises. She had also found new purpose in her own life, using her organizational skills and social connections to support military families, dealing with deployment separations, and security-related isolation. Her work had evolved from social entertaining to meaningful service, and the change had brought her a sense of fulfillment she'd never experienced before. Derek had been promoted again, and this time when Natalie celebrated his achievement, she did so with full awareness of the broader context of military service. She understood now that his success was part of a larger mission that included my work and the work of thousands of others, whose contributions remained largely invisible. The most significant change came when I decided to buy a new car. Nothing flashy or expensive, but something reliable and appropriate for someone with my security clearance level. When I showed up at Natalie's house in a modest but newer sedan, she smiled and shook her head. "You know, I used to think that car was a symbol of your failure," she said. "Now I understand it was a symbol of your commitment to something bigger than material display." "It was also just an old car that needed replacing," I said with a laugh. "Maybe, but I've learned that with you, nothing is ever just what it appears to be on the surface." As we sat in her kitchen that morning, drinking coffee and discussing everything from Derek's latest assignment to her plans for a new military family support program, I reflected on how much had changed since that painful conversation months earlier. We had both learned to see past surface appearances, to deeper truths about success, service, and what it meant to build a meaningful life. The work I did hadn't changed. I still spent my days managing cyber warfare operations, coordinating with international allies, and protecting critical infrastructure from sophisticated threats. But I no longer carried the burden of that work alone, isolated from family understanding and support. Natalie's life hadn't changed dramatically either. She still lived in her beautiful home, still organized social events, still took pride in Derek's career advancement. But now she understood these activities as part of a larger tapestry of service and contribution, valuable in their own right, rather than as measures of competitive success. "Victoria," she said, as I prepared to leave for another classified briefing, "I want you to know something. When people ask me about my sister now, I tell them you're a hero. Nat, that's not necessary. Yes, it is, not because of your rank, or your clearance level or the operations you coordinate. Because you've spent your entire adult life working to keep people safe, and you've done it without needing credit, or recognition, or public acknowledgement. That's what service means. I know that now, and I'm proud to be the sister of someone who understands service at that level. As I drove to the naval facility that morning, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. The revelation I had feared for so long had ultimately freed both of us to be authentic about our choices, our values, and our definitions of success. I had learned that protecting my work didn't require hiding my worth, and that family relationships could coexist with security requirements if built on trust rather than deception. Natalie had learned that success came in many forms, and that the most important contributions often happened away from public recognition. Most importantly, we had both learned that love could survive misunderstanding, that relationships could grow stronger through honesty, and that different definitions of meaningful life could coexist within the same family. The secure briefing that awaited me would likely involve new threats, complex international situations, and decisions that affected global stability. But for the first time in years, I would return home afterward to a family that understood and supported the work I did, even if they couldn't know the details. That support didn't make the work easier, but it made the burden of responsibility more bearable. It reminded me that behind every strategic decision and tactical response were real people living real lives, including a sister who had learned to be proud of who I really was, rather than disappointed in who she thought I should be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.